Sometimes we look for solutions to our problems in the most unusual places. We might seek out a new technique to manage pain or a quick way to solve a financial problem. We do it because we think it's going to make our lives better, easier. But what happens when that so-called solution, the very thing that's supposed to help you, ends up being the worst thing that could ever happen? What if that fix, that shortcut, leads directly to a tragic end? Today, we have two stories about people who found solutions to their problems, but these solutions came with a cost that no one could have ever predicted. On the 15th of March 2011, just after 1 in the afternoon, 16-year-old Marcus Freeman was behind the wheel of his dad's pickup truck. He was driving down a highway in Northport, Florida, with his girlfriend Carly beside him. A song he loved came on the radio, and he started belting out the lyrics, and Carly joined right in with him. They had just come from the dentist's office where Marcus had gotten some dental work done. His jaw was really starting to ache, a deep, throbbing pain that was hard to ignore. The singing was mostly a way to distract himself from it, and for a little while, it was working. But every time a song would end and a commercial would come on, the pain would rush back, and it was all he could think about. But Marcus wasn't your typical 16-year-old. He was used to dealing with discomfort, both physical and mental. He had been working really hard to become the kind of person who could push through pain. He was the starting quarterback for the varsity football team at Northport High, and that came with a lot of pressure. Over the past year, he had gotten serious about his physical fitness. He was doing these incredibly difficult, vomit-inducing workouts to get stronger and faster. He knew that physical toughness was part of the game. And then there was the mental side of things. Being the quarterback, all eyes were on him. The nerves before a big game could be overwhelming. He felt a general level of anxiety that a lot of high performers feel. So, he had started working with a school counselor to develop techniques to manage those nerves, to stay calm under pressure. So, dealing with pain, whether it was the ache in his muscles after a workout or the anxiety in his chest before a game, was something Marcus was actively working on. He was a very forward-leaning kid, always trying to improve himself. And all of this hard work seemed to be paying off in a big way. The Northport High football team, which had been terrible for years, was now coming off one of their best seasons ever, and a lot of that was because of Marcus's leadership on the field. But it wasn't just the football team that was on an upswing. The entire school seemed to be transforming. For a long time, Northport High had a bad reputation. The sports teams were bad, graduation rates were low, and test scores were in the basement. It just wasn't a great place to be. But now, it felt like Leaning Corn had totally turned a corner. It wasn't just football. Other sports programs were improving too. Student grades and test scores were going up across the board. And maybe most importantly, the students just seemed happier. There was a better energy in the hallways. It wasn't just Marcus who was thriving, it felt like everyone was. And if you asked anyone at Northport High why this was happening, they would all give you the same answer. There was one person to thank for this incredible turnaround, their principal, George Kenny. Mr. Kenny had been the principal for about a decade, but in the last few years, he had really changed things up. He introduced new ideas to the curriculum and put a huge new focus on providing individual support for every student. He wanted each kid to feel seen and heard and helped. And the results seemed to speak for themselves. The whole school was flourishing under his leadership. But right now, as Marcus drove down that highway, none of that was on his mind. The only thing he could think about was the searing pain in his jaw. It felt like it was getting worse with every passing second. It was no longer just an ache, it was a sharp, throbbing pulse that was starting to make him feel dizzy. But Marcus had been working on pain management. He had his techniques, the same ones he used to push through exhaustion on the football field or to calm his nerves before a big play. He was going to use those techniques now. As Carly sat next to him, he took a slow, deep breath and tried to relax his body. He tried to just breathe and let his mind go somewhere else, anywhere else but the pain. This was literally what his counselor had taught him. He would do this mental exercise where he would let his mind drift away from the physical discomfort, focusing on something else entirely. It was almost like a form of meditation, and it usually worked for him. He could find a way to push through. But this time was different. It just wasn't working. The pain in his jaw just kept hammering away, and he couldn't get it out of his head. Soon, it felt like the pain was growing, radiating up from his jaw, across his cheek, and into his entire head. It was becoming completely overwhelming. But he stayed focused. He kept trying to separate his mind from the pain. And then, all of a sudden, the throbbing stopped. Just like that, it was gone. And Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. While Marcus was going through this intense internal battle, Carly was in the passenger seat fiddling with the radio dial. She was trying to find another good song they could sing along to. Carly loved spending time with Marcus. She liked him so much that she had just tagged along to his dentist appointment just so they could hang out a little longer. She thought he was incredibly kind and funny. When she was with him, they could talk and laugh for hours, and it would feel like only a minute had passed. But as she was searching for a new station, she realized Marcus had gone completely silent. It was unusual for him. She looked over at him, and what she saw made her gasp. Marcus seemed to have gone totally rigid. His arms were locked straight out in front of him, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were turning white. His head was tilted back slightly, and his eyes were starting to roll back into his head. He was staring up at the ceiling of the truck, not at the road. Carly started screaming his name, trying to snap him out of it. "Marcus! Marcus, what are you doing?" she yelled, clapping her hands and shaking his shoulder. But he didn't answer. He didn't even seem to hear her. He just stayed in that bizarre, stiff state while the truck continued to speed down the highway at nearly 100 miles an hour. Panic set in. Carly was screaming, grabbing at his arm, trying to get him to look at her, to move, to do anything. But it was like he wasn't there anymore. It was like he was gone. Then Carly turned her head and looked through the windshield. Her scream turned into one of pure terror as she saw the truck was veering off the road, heading straight for a large tree on the shoulder. The impact was instant. And for Carly, everything went black. A few hours later, Carly's eyes slowly opened. Her entire body ached, and her head was pounding with a dull, heavy rhythm. At first, she had no idea where she was. Then she heard the steady beeping of machines next to her. She looked around the room. It was stark white. She realized she was in a hospital. And as soon as she made that connection, the entire horrible memory came flooding back. She remembered Marcus, the strange way he looked, stiff and unresponsive at the wheel. She remembered the crash, the sound of metal hitting the tree. As she was trying to process it all, a nurse came into the room. Carly's first words were about Marcus. "Where is Marcus?" she asked. "Is he okay? Can I see him?" The nurse had a very gentle, sad look on her face. And that's when Carly learned the devastating truth. Marcus was dead. Almost a month passed. It was April 8th, and Carly was back at Northport High School, sitting in her Spanish class. She was trying her best to focus on the teacher's lesson, but concentration was something that just didn't come easily to her anymore. Physically, her injuries from the crash had healed, but emotionally, she was still in pieces. Marcus's death had completely shattered her world. But maybe the hardest part of it all was that there was no explanation for what had happened. Why had he been acting that way right before they crashed? What had happened to him in that truck? It was a huge, unanswered question that hung over everyone. The official story in the media was that Marcus had simply lost control of his vehicle. But Carly knew that wasn't right. She was there. She saw what happened. Marcus went into some kind of trance, and it was that frozen, rigid state that caused the truck to veer off the road at 100 miles an hour. There was no bad weather that day. There were no obstacles on the road. Whatever caused Marcus to freeze up was what caused the crash. But nobody was talking about that part. It felt like nobody even understood it. Of course, there were theories floating around, especially at school. A lot of students thought that maybe Marcus had received some kind of sedative at the dentist and had a delayed bad reaction to it while he was driving. Others wondered if he had just had some sort of random, sudden medical event, like a seizure or a stroke. But when the results of his autopsy were released, it put those theories to rest. There was no trace of any drugs in his system, and there was no indication that he had suffered a stroke, a seizure, or an aneurysm. So, those explanations were ruled out. Because the crash was considered a tragic accident and not a case of foul play, the police weren't investigating it any further. They had been at the scene, they had documented what happened, but there was no deeper investigation to find out why it happened. For Carly, this was a difficult reality to accept. She knew it was possible that she, and everyone else who loved Marcus, might never get the answers they were so desperate for. It might just remain a mystery forever. And it was so hard to go back to normal life, to sit in class and pretend to be a regular kid again, when there was this giant hole in her life that felt like it would never be filled. But Carly wasn't the only one grieving. Marcus had been an incredibly popular and well-loved student at Northport High. After their principal, Mr. Kenny, had announced his death to the student body, there was an outpouring of grief. There were memorial services and student gatherings. Mr. Kenny made sure that grief counselors were brought into the school to help students process the terrible loss. And so, as Carly sat there in her Spanish class trying to listen, the school's announcement system crackled to life. It was Mr. Kenny's voice. He said he had something to tell them. Carly could tell immediately from his tone that it wasn't going to be good news. Normally, Mr. Kenny was an upbeat, enthusiastic person. His voice was usually full of energy. But right now, it sounded solemn, and there was a slight tremor in it as he spoke. He started to say something, then he stopped himself and cleared his throat. And then he just said it. Another Northport student has just died. In the weeks that followed that awful announcement, Carly tried to make sense of how it was even possible. 2 students from their school had died in less than 2 months. This second death was different from Marcus's. It was self-inflicted. But still, Northport was a small, tight-knit school. This was not a place where young people just suddenly started dying. It just didn't happen. But then, just a few weeks after that, in early May, Carly's confusion turned into complete and utter disbelief. Another Northport student died. This death was also self-inflicted. The news sent Carly and the rest of the already fragile student body into a state of shock. 2 deaths so close together had been hard enough to process, but 3 was just unthinkable. A dark cloud seemed to settle over the entire school. It felt like the entire student body was on edge, almost bracing for more bad news, as if more death was just inevitable. One night, not long after the 3rd death, Carly was at home in her room, scrolling through Facebook on her computer. She came across a post from one of her classmates. It was a short post, but when she read it, she couldn't believe she hadn't thought of it herself. The post pointed out that all 3 of the recent deaths had one very specific thing in common. So many people at Northport High, from students to staff to parents, believed that the school's recent incredible improvements were all because of their principal, Mr. Kenny. He was known for being very student-focused, for giving kids a lot of individual attention to help them succeed. But Mr. Kenny also had a secret. For the past 3 years, Mr. Kenny had been holding private meetings with students and staff members to help them with their personal issues. Things like anxiety, pain management, mental health struggles, trouble concentrating, or improving test scores. He was working with them one-on-one to help them become the best versions of themselves. And to do this, he was putting them under hypnosis. Mr. Kenny would invite students, sometimes as many as 2 a day, into his office for these private recorded hypnosis sessions. He did the same thing for teachers who were struggling. He even sometimes brought entire sports teams into his office and would hypnotize them all together before big games to help them improve their performance. But there was a critical detail here. Mr. Kenny didn't just perform the hypnosis himself. He also taught the students how to do it on their own, how to perform self-hypnosis. The problem was, Mr. Kenny had only ever taken a very brief course in hypnosis. He had no license to be using it as a therapeutic tool to diagnose or resolve actual mental or physical health issues. He was not qualified or licensed to be doing this. But for a while, it seemed to be working. A lot of kids responded really well to his sessions. They reported feeling less anxious, more focused. Some of the athletes started excelling in their sports like never before. But along with these positive results, there were also some very alarming side effects. Some parents at Northport reported that their children started having strange personality changes after they began hypnosis sessions with Mr. Kenny. They said their kids would sometimes just get these blank stares on their faces. Others said that after a session, their child would seem disoriented, or they would start doing things they would never normally do. Some even began talking about hurting themselves. And so, after the third student death, that Facebook post that Carly saw had revealed the one thing that connected all three tragedies. All three of the students who had died had been repeatedly hypnotized by Mr. Kenny. Now, Mr. Kenny swore that he was not responsible for their deaths. But he was ultimately charged with practicing therapeutic hypnosis without a license, and he received a year of probation. The Sarasota County School Board also paid a total of $600,000 to the families of the three victims. As for Mr. Kenny, he has since retired from teaching. The solution he offered his students, a way to manage their pain and anxiety, had become an unimaginable tragedy. While that principal's solution led to disaster, in our next story, a man's own solution to his problems would bring him face to face with a consequence he never, ever saw coming. Shortly after 8 o'clock at night on the 9th of October, 1996, a 31-year-old man named Anthony Irvin was walking down a dark sidewalk in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He was heading towards a local grocery store. It wasn't freezing out, but there was a chilly wind blowing and it was pretty dark. Anthony only had a light jacket on, and he was starting to feel uncomfortable. He pulled the thin jacket tighter around himself as he walked. All he wanted to do was go home where it was warm. But he couldn't do that. Not yet. First, he needed money. Once he had money, then he could go home. Anthony had lived a pretty rough life. For the most part, he was a career criminal. He hadn't held down a regular job in a very long time. Instead, whenever he needed cash, like he did tonight, he would either steal from a local business or he would mug someone on the street. Over the past 9 years, he had been arrested 8 separate times for crimes like robbery and assault. To the people in his neighborhood, he was mostly just a huge nuisance. Even if some of them felt sorry for his situation, he was still a problem. But despite how often he committed these crimes, they were always relatively petty. So, he never served very much time in prison. He always ended up right back out on the street, and he always ended up right back to his old ways. But tonight, as Anthony walked down that empty road, he wasn't thinking about how his actions affected his neighbors. He was just thinking about finding a place or a person to rob. And tonight, he decided he was going to look for a person. He needed a target. As he walked, he actually started to get a little worried. The street seemed quieter than usual. There was almost nobody out. He started to think that if he didn't find someone soon, he was going to be out of luck for the night. No money. But just then, he saw someone up ahead. A young man turned the corner and started walking up the sidewalk, right in Anthony's direction. He looked like a smaller guy, younger, and he was all by himself. And right away, Anthony thought, perfect. This is my mark. I'm going to rob this guy. So Anthony started walking towards this unsuspecting young man. As he got closer, he had a sudden realization. He knew this person. It was his neighbor, Harry. And Anthony thought to himself, oh, this is even more perfect, because he knew Harry. He knew that Harry was super soft-spoken and gentle. He was a calm person. He's not going to put up a fight. He's going to be so easy to rob. Sure, it was a terrible thing to do, to rob your own neighbor. Harry would know it was him. But Anthony figured, what's he going to do about it? So Anthony marched right up to Harry and stopped directly in front of him, completely blocking his path on the sidewalk. And then Anthony delivered his classic, time-tested mugging threat. A few minutes later, a detective with the Philadelphia Police Department named Perry Kelly was driving his cruiser fast down a city street. He had gotten a call about a mugging in progress, and he was hoping he could get there in time to catch the person responsible or at least get a look at them before they got away. So Kelly turned a corner and pulled up in front of the address he'd been given. As his headlights swept across the sidewalk, he saw two men. One of them was lying motionless on the ground. The other one was sitting right on top of him. And Detective Kelly's first thought was, perfect. I got him. He assumed the man on top was the mugger. He had caught him in the act. He was about to jump out of his car and make an arrest. But he was wrong. When Detective Kelly got out of his car and learned what had actually happened there, it would turn out to be the single strangest thing he had ever encountered in his entire 25-year career. So, when Anthony mugged people, he had a specific method he always used. He would put his hand deep into his coat pocket and press his fingers forward, making it look like he was holding a gun inside the pocket. He would aim his hand towards his target and say something like, "Hey, I got a gun. Give me all your money or I'm going to shoot you." And it usually worked. People would look down, they'd see the bulge in his jacket that they thought was a gun, and rather than risk it, they'd just hand over their wallets. It wasn't worth finding out if the gun was real or not. Anthony would grab the money and take off. He was thinking that this exact trick would work perfectly on Harry. This meek young kid would be an easy score. So he walks up to Harry, stands in front of him, and blocks his way. Harry, who hadn't seen him coming, actually bumps into him and seems confused. And that's when Anthony delivers the line. His hand is in his pocket, pretending it's a gun. "Hand over all your money or I'm going to shoot." But Harry, whether he believed Anthony had a gun or not, had no way of seeing it to confirm. Because Harry was blind. And Anthony knew Harry was blind. They were neighbors. In Anthony's mind, that's what made him such a perfect victim. He was going to rob the small blind kid from down the street. That was his plan. But what Anthony didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly known, was that in addition to being blind, Harry also happened to be a karate master and a master wrestler as well. So when Harry was suddenly confronted by a man telling him he was about to be shot, his self-defense instincts took over instantly. He grabbed Anthony, flipped him completely over his shoulder, and slammed him hard into the concrete ground. The impact broke Anthony's neck, and he was killed instantly. And then Harry simply sat on top of his body and waited for the police to arrive. Harry was never charged with any crime in connection with Anthony's death. It was clearly determined that he had acted in self-defense. And even though the media at the time called him a hero for what he did, Harry himself felt terrible that he had killed Anthony. He never meant for that to happen. He was just protecting himself. He later called the whole thing a tragedy. It leaves you wondering how many other solutions are out there just waiting to become someone's greatest tragedy. But after hearing these stories, you will wonder, how many times do we often trust something just because it is said to help us? And how do we know when a solution has quietly crossed the line into something dangerous? Currently, we are constantly seeking quicker solutions for stress, pain, and pressure. The real question is whether we are solving our problems or just handing them over to things we don't fully understand. Thank you so much for watching. In 2007, a movie came out that would quietly change the course of one young man's life. The film was called Into the Wild, and it was based on the true story of Christopher McCandless. Christopher was a bright kid who graduated from a top-tier university with honors. By all accounts, he had the world at his feet. He could have taken any number of high-paying jobs and settled into a comfortable life. But Christopher didn't want comfort. He wanted something more raw, more real. He wanted absolute freedom. So, in 1990, without a word to his worried parents, he made a radical choice. He He donated his entire life savings to charity, abandoned his car, shed his old identity, and set off for the Alaskan wilderness to live completely off the grid. He eventually found an abandoned city bus deep in the backcountry and made it his home. He survived out there for 113 days before tragically succumbing to starvation. While his story ends in tragedy, the movie focuses less on his death and more on his incredible spirit and his unwavering quest for a life of purpose and adventure. It leaves you feeling not so much sad, but inspired. Inspired to take risks, to seek out your own adventures before it's too late. One person who was deeply moved by this story was an 18-year-old from Oregon named Matt Higgins. Matt was just about to graduate from high school, and like a lot of kids his age, he was at a crossroads. He didn't have a clear plan. The paths of college or getting a full-time job didn't feel quite right to him yet. He felt like he needed something else first, some kind of experience that would help him figure out who he was. After seeing Into the Wild, a third option crystallized in his mind. He would have his own wilderness adventure, just like Christopher McCandless. But this wouldn't be a permanent departure from society. For Matt, it was a chance to hit the pause button on real life, to challenge himself, to go out and find himself in the quiet solitude of nature. And then, once he'd done that, he could come back and figure out the rest of his life. His plan was ambitious. After graduating in 2007, he would spend the winter saving up and preparing. Then, in the spring of 2008, he would embark on a solo journey to hike the entire California section of the Pacific Crest Trail, or the PCT. This was no small undertaking. The California section of the PCT is a formidable beast, stretching roughly 1,700 miles from the border of Mexico all the way north to the border of Oregon. The trail is a study in contrasts. It winds through scorching deserts, climbs over snow-capped mountains, and cuts through some of the most remote and dense forests in the country. There's dangerous wildlife to contend with, from rattlesnakes to mountain lions to black bears. And maybe most significantly, there are long stretches of the trail where a hiker is completely isolated, miles and miles away from the nearest road or town. If you get into trouble out there, you are well and truly on your own. It was not a hike for beginners. But Matt wasn't a beginner. He had spent his entire childhood exploring the outdoors. He grew up hiking and camping all over Oregon and the Pacific Northwest. He was just as comfortable on a well-marked state park trail as he was navigating the rugged, unmarked backcountry where you had to be constantly aware of your surroundings. He knew how to read a map and compass, how to pack for long treks, how to handle bad weather, and how to stay calm in a crisis. He felt that his years of experience made him perfectly suited for a challenge of this magnitude. And in many ways, he was right. He was prepared for the physical exhaustion, the harsh weather, and the dangers posed by Mother Nature. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for what was actually waiting for him out there in the wilderness. After his high school graduation in 2007, Matt stuck to his plan. He worked and saved money, meticulously planned his route, and gathered all the necessary gear. In the spring of 2008, he said goodbye to his family, took a flight down to Southern California, and made his way to the dusty, sun-baked border of Mexico. There, at the southern terminus of the Pacific Crest Trail, he took his first steps north. His great adventure had begun. For the first few weeks, the hike was everything he had hoped it would be. He fell into a rhythm. Wake up with the sun, eat a quick breakfast, pack up his camp, and hike. He'd walk all day, pushing his body to its limits, feeling the satisfying burn in his legs as he ticked off the miles. The scenery was breathtaking, changing every day from arid desert landscapes to lush green valleys. At night, when he was too tired to go any further or when the light began to fade, he would find a suitable spot just off the trail, set up his small one-man tent, cook a simple meal, and crawl into his sleeping bag. The silence of the wilderness was absolute, and he would fall asleep almost instantly, exhausted but deeply content. The next morning, he would wake up and do it all over again. During this initial part of his journey, the challenges he faced were the kind you'd expect on a long-distance hike. There was the constant battle against fatigue. There was one particularly hot stretch in the desert where he got a bit dehydrated and had to rest for a day to recover. Another time, he was walking along and almost stepped right on a coiled rattlesnake that was sunning itself on the trail. He jumped back just in time, his heart pounding in his chest, and waited for the snake to slither away. But aside from those minor incidents, the hike was going smoothly. By his standards, it was almost routine. He felt strong, capable, and completely in his element. But that feeling of routine and control was about to be shattered. When Matt reached the Lassen National Forest in Northern California, about 150 miles from his finish line at the Oregon border, his journey would take a dark and terrifying turn. Lassen National Forest is a vast, dense wilderness. Shortly after entering it, the trail changed dramatically. Matt found himself on a narrow, winding dirt path flanked on both sides by a thick wall of trees. The pines and firs grew so close together and so tall that they formed a canopy high above, blocking out much of the sunlight. It was like walking through a green tunnel. The dense forest muffled all sound, creating a deep, profound quiet. All Matt could hear was the gentle chirping of birds, the buzzing of insects, and the soft crunch of his own boots on the dirt. It was peaceful, almost meditative. He was in no particular rush, just soaking in the solitude and the beauty of his surroundings. At some point, the trail took a sharp right turn. As Matt rounded the bend, he looked up and stopped for a second, a little startled. About 20 feet ahead, just off the right side of the path, there was a large boulder. And sitting on that boulder were two people, a man and a woman, probably middle-aged. The first thing Matt noticed was that they were both dressed entirely in white. Their clothes were dirty and stained as if they'd been wearing them for a very long time. The man had a long, wild, unkempt beard. The woman's hair was matted. But it wasn't their appearance that was so unsettling. It was the way they were looking at him. They were both just sitting there, perfectly still, staring at him with an intense, unblinking gaze. There was no expression on their faces. Not curiosity, not friendliness, not hostility. Just a blank, piercing stare. Feeling a bit awkward, Matt immediately dropped his gaze to the ground and kept walking. As he got closer, he decided he should at least be friendly. He looked back up, gave them a small, slightly uncomfortable smile and a little wave, and said, "Hi." They didn't respond. They didn't smile back. They didn't wave. They didn't even nod. They just continued to stare at him with those same empty eyes as he walked right past them. A wave of unease washed over Matt. He could feel their eyes on his back as he continued down the trail. He had the powerful, prickly sensation of being watched, and he fought the urge to turn around and look back at them. He just kept walking, his mind racing. Why were they so strange? Why wouldn't they even acknowledge him? That was the thing that really bothered him. On a trail as remote as the PCT, there's an unwritten code among hikers. You can go for days without seeing another soul. So when you do cross paths with someone, you always acknowledge them. A hello, a nod, a simple wave. It's a way of checking in, of confirming that you're both okay out there in the middle of nowhere. In fact, Matt hadn't seen another person for the last 2 days. These two were the first. And their complete lack of response felt wrong. It felt unnatural. But he tried to rationalize it. He told himself he didn't know their story. Maybe they were having a bad day. Maybe they were foreign tourists and didn't speak English. Who knew? It was none of his business, he decided. He put them out of his mind and just kept walking, never once looking back. A few hours later, the sun began to set, and the already dim light inside the forest tunnel started to fade fast. It was time to make camp. But the trees were still packed so tightly against the edges of the trail that there was no space to set up a tent without blocking the path. Matt didn't want to be an obstruction for any other potential hikers, so he decided to head off trail. He stepped off the path and began pushing his way through the dense undergrowth deeper into the forest. After walking for what he estimated was about 300 feet, the trees finally opened up into a small, secluded clearing. It was the perfect spot. He quickly set up his tent, then got out his small camp stove and cooked himself some dinner. When he was finished eating, he carefully packed all of his remaining food into a waterproof bag. He sealed it tightly, tied a long piece of cord to it, and then tossed the cord up and over a high branch on a nearby tree. He hoisted the bag up until it was dangling at least 15 feet off the ground, then tied off the other end of the cord to the tree trunk. This was standard procedure in bear country. It kept his food safe from any curious animals during the night. With his camp secured and the last of the daylight gone, it was now completely pitch black. Matt crawled into his tent, zipped up the door, wriggled into his sleeping bag, and was asleep in minutes. The next morning, Matt woke up just as the first hints of dawn were breaking. It was still quite dark, but there was just enough gray light filtering through the trees for him to see. He unzipped his tent flap and peeked outside. The first thing he noticed was that his food bag was gone. The cord was still hanging from the tree branch, but it had been cut and the bag itself was nowhere to be seen. His initial thought was a bear. He figured a clever black bear must have come into his camp during the night, somehow managed to get the bag down, and then ran off with it. He sighed, annoyed at the loss of his food, but also a little impressed by the bear's ingenuity. He climbed out of his tent and started walking over to the tree, scanning the ground for bear tracks to confirm his theory. He got to the base of the tree and looked down. He didn't see any bear prints in the soft dirt, but he did see something else. He saw two distinct sets of human boot prints, and neither of them matched his own. Before he could even fully process what that meant, his eyes followed the tracks away from the tree, and his blood ran cold. The boot prints weren't just under the tree. He looked around the clearing and saw that they were everywhere. They led right up to the flap of his tent. They circled his tent. They crisscrossed all over his small campsite. As Matt stood there, staring at this disturbing network of footprints, his mind struggled to make sense of it. How was this possible? He had gone to sleep when it was already pitch black. He woke up when it was still dark. This meant that two people had somehow managed to find his campsite, which was 300 feet off the main trail in the middle of a dense, unmarked forest. And they had done it in the dead of night in total darkness without making a single sound that would have woken him up. How could anyone do that? And then it hit him. The people on the rock. The man and woman in white. It had to be them. They must have seen him, followed him at a distance, watched where he left the trail to make camp, and then waited until he was asleep to sneak in and rob him. The thought that they had been watching him all that time, standing silently in the darkness just feet away from where he slept, sent a shiver down his spine. And then a new, more urgent thought entered his mind. What if they were still here? What if they were watching him right now? He suddenly felt incredibly exposed. He whipped his head around, his eyes darting from tree to tree, half expecting to see their pale figures peering out at him from behind a trunk. He saw nothing. But that prickly feeling of being watched was back, and it was stronger than ever. Panic began to set in. He abandoned any thought of making breakfast. He just needed to get out of there. As quickly and quietly as he could, he stuffed his sleeping bag into his pack, took down his tent, and packed up the rest of his gear. Every little sound he made seemed to echo in the silent forest. He kept his movements calm and deliberate, trying not to show his fear, all the while thinking that at any moment they were going to emerge from the trees, or worse, grab him from behind. He shouldered his pack, which felt much lighter without his food, and started walking as fast as he could back in the direction of the trail. The 300-foot walk back felt like a mile. Finally, he broke through the last line of trees and was back on the narrow dirt path. He looked up and down the trail. It was empty. He took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to calm his racing heart. They were gone. He was safe, for now. He turned north and started walking, much faster than before. For the next several hours, Matt walked with a new sense of urgency. Every few minutes, he would glance over his shoulder, still half expecting to see the man and woman in white following him. But the trail behind him always remained empty. Eventually, the dense, claustrophobic forest began to thin out, and the narrow path opened up into a wide, beautiful meadow. The sun was high in the sky now, and its warm rays felt reassuring on his skin. In the open field, he could see for a great distance in every direction. There was nowhere for anyone to hide. Being out of the dark woods helped to ease his paranoia. And as he walked, he started to rationalize what had happened. Okay, he thought, it was incredibly creepy that those people followed him and snuck into his camp in the middle of the night. That was undeniable. But maybe their motives were simple. They were dressed in dirty clothes and looked disheveled. They were probably just desperately hungry. They clearly needed the food more than he did. And all they did was take the food. They didn't try to hurt him. They didn't even touch his tent. So, you know what? They could have the food. It was a scary experience, but it was over. He had left their territory, and he would never have to see or deal with the people in white ever again. He was wrong. Over the next 3 days, Matt continued his trek north through the Lawson Forest. The trail would alternate between those big open meadows and the dense dark sections of forest. During those 3 days, he saw no sign of the strange couple. No one bothered his campsites at night. Nothing else was stolen. This only reinforced his belief that the food theft had been a one-time incident, a crime of opportunity. They had gotten what they wanted, and they had moved on. He was starting to feel like himself again. But on the 4th day after the incident, the terror would return, and it would be far worse than before. On that 4th night, the trail led him deep into another one of those heavily forested areas. Just like before, when it came time to make camp, he was forced to venture off the trail to find a clearing. He walked several hundred feet into the woods, found a suitable spot, and set up his tent. But this time, he took an extra precaution. After what had happened before, he had developed a new routine. He walked around the entire perimeter of his campsite, gathering dry sticks and twigs. He then carefully laid them out on the ground in a wide circle around his tent. It was a makeshift early warning system. If any person or large animal got too close to his camp during the night, they would have to step on one of the sticks. The snap of the breaking wood would hopefully be loud enough to wake him up. With his campsite and his alarm system in place, Matt ate a quick dinner, secured his new supply of food high up in a tree, and then crawled into his tent. He was still on edge, but he felt a little safer with his stick perimeter. He eventually fell asleep. A few hours later, in the dead of night, Matt's eyes snapped open. He was instantly awake. He lay perfectly still in the absolute total blackness of his tent, straining his ears. He didn't know what had woken him. Maybe it was a noise, maybe it was just a feeling. He held his breath, listening to the silence of the forest. And then he heard it. It was a sharp, distinct cracking sound. The sound of a dry stick being snapped in half. Someone or something had just stepped on his perimeter. His heart immediately started hammering against his rib. An animal? Or a person? He didn't know, but he knew something was just a few feet away from him in the darkness. Instinct took over. As slowly and silently as he could, he slid his arm out of his sleeping bag. His hand fumbled in the dark for the familiar handle of his large hunting knife that he now kept right next to him. As his fingers wrapped around the handle, he heard more sounds. Footsteps. Whoever was out there wasn't being stealthy anymore. They hadn't been startled by the sound of the breaking stick. They were still moving, and they were moving directly towards his tent. Matt's mind replayed the image of the boot prints circling his tent a few nights ago. He was almost certain this wasn't an animal. It was them. The people in white were back. He clutched the knife tightly, his knuckles white. He was in the middle of nowhere, completely alone. If these people meant him harm, no one would hear him scream. He prepared himself to slash out through the fabric of the tent if he had to. The footsteps grew closer and closer until they stopped. They stopped right next to the side of the tent where his head was laying. They were maybe a foot away from him. He could almost feel their presence through the thin nylon wall. He was frozen, listening, waiting for what would happen next. And then he started to hear whispering. But it was strange. The whispering wasn't just coming from the person standing right next to his tent. It seemed to be coming from all around him, from different directions out in the forest. It was a low, frantic murmur, and he couldn't make out any words. As the disembodied whispering grew more agitated, the person right outside his tent began to move again. They started walking in a slow, deliberate circle around his tent. So now he was lying there in the dark, listening to footsteps circling him and frantic whispers coming from all directions. The sheer strangeness and terror of the situation was overwhelming. He was so petrified he couldn't move. The knife in his hand felt useless. He was just a terrified kid trapped in a thin nylon box surrounded by what? He had no idea. Then, just as suddenly as it had all started, it stopped. The footsteps ceased. The whispering went silent. The forest was plunged back into a dead, heavy silence. In a way, it was a relief. But in another, more terrifying way, it wasn't. Because he hadn't heard the sound of footsteps retreating. He hadn't heard them walk away back into the forest. It was as if one moment they were right there, circling him, and the next they had simply vanished. Or, and this was the thought that truly horrified him, they were still out there. Still surrounding his tent, but now they were just standing there. Motionless. Silent. Waiting. Waiting for him to do something. Waiting for him to come out. He lay there for what felt like an eternity, paralyzed by fear, wondering how many people were standing just outside his tent. 1? 2? 5? 10? There was no way to know. He didn't dare make a sound. He didn't even dare to breathe too loudly. He just waited for the sun to come up. When the first gray light of dawn finally began to filter through the fabric of his tent, he still hadn't heard any sounds of them leaving. For all he knew, they were still standing there, waiting for him. He knew he couldn't stay in the tent forever. He had to look. Taking a deep breath, he reached for the zipper, pulled it down in one quick loud motion, and threw the tent flap open, his knife held out in front of him. He looked outside. There was no one there. He scrambled out of the tent, ready to confront anyone he saw, but the clearing was empty. He scanned the tree line, his eyes searching for any sign of movement, any flash of white. Nothing. But was he really alone? Or were they just hiding, watching him from a few feet away behind the trees? He started to wonder if he had imagined the whole thing. Was it all just a vivid, terrifying nightmare? But then he looked down at the ground. And there they were. Clear boot prints all over his campsite, including a perfectly worn circle in the dirt all the way around his tent. It had been real. All of it. That was it. He was done. He didn't even bother to pack neatly. He just shoved everything into his backpack as fast as he could, threw it over his shoulder, and started running. He crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping at his face, not caring about the noise, just running back towards the trail. When he reached the path, he didn't slow down. He just kept running north. As he ran, looking back over his shoulder every few seconds, he had one thought repeating in his head, get out of Lassen National Forest. He told himself that this was their territory. If he could just get out of this forest, get away from their turf, they would leave him alone. This thought fueled him, and he ran and fast-hiked for the rest of the day. By late afternoon, he had finally made it out of the forest. He emerged from the tree line and found himself on the outskirts of a small town that bordered the park. That night, he set up his camp as close to the town as he could, wanting the comforting lights and sounds of civilization nearby. As he lay in his tent that night, unable to sleep, he replayed the events of the last few days over and over in his mind. He was now convinced that the man and woman in white were behind everything. The first encounter, where they stole his food, was creepy, but it made a twisted kind of sense. They were hungry. But the second encounter, the one from the previous night, made no sense at all. Assuming it was them, it meant they had been following him for days completely unseen. Even though he had been constantly looking over his shoulder for them, they had managed to shadow him without him ever spotting them. How was that possible? And then, how had they found his campsite again, another random spot hundreds of feet off the trail? And once they were there, what were they doing? What was the point of circling his tent and whispering? It wasn't to steal anything. It felt more like they were trying to terrorize him. And how did they just disappear into thin air without making a sound? None of it added up. It was all a terrifying, illogical nightmare. The next morning, as he packed up his camp, he seriously considered quitting the hike. He could just call his family, tell them to come pick him up, and go home. It was the safe, sane thing to do. But this hike meant so much to him. He was only about 100 miles from the finish line. He had already come over 1,600 miles. He had poured so much of himself into this journey, and he couldn't stand the thought of giving up now, so close to the end. He wanted to finish what he started. So he made a decision. He would keep going. He shouldered his pack and continued north, leaving the small town behind and heading towards his next challenge, the Mount Shasta National Forest. Mount Shasta was in many ways similar to Lassen. It was another vast, dense wilderness. But Mount Shasta carried with it a much more sinister reputation. For decades, it has been a hotspot for strange and baffling disappearances. An unusually high number of people have vanished without a trace within the forest. Some of the most frightening stories come from people who were with someone who disappeared. They'll say that their friend or family member was walking right in front of them, they turned their back for just a moment, and when they looked again, the person was gone. Just gone. No tracks, no sound, no sign of a struggle. As if they were erased from existence. Despite massive search efforts, many of these people are never seen again. Knowing this, Matt entered the Mount Shasta forest with a deep sense of dread. He was once again on a narrow trail surrounded by a thick wall of trees. Every shadow looked like a person. Every snap of a twig made him jump. He felt like he was being watched again, and he just kept his head down, focused on putting one foot in front of the other, telling himself he was almost done. For the first 3 days in Mount Shasta, nothing happened. He hiked as far as he could each day, set up his camp, and spent the night undisturbed. He didn't see the people in white, or anyone else for that matter. A part of him started to hope that he had finally left them behind. But on the 4th day, that hope was extinguished. On that 4th day, the trail took him out of the dense woods and up onto the side of a mountain. At this higher elevation, the trees were much sparser. The visibility was incredible. He could see the trail snaking for miles ahead of him, and when he turned around, he could see it stretching for miles behind him. It was a beautiful, clear day. He was just walking along, enjoying the view, when at some point he casually turned to look back down the trail. He had been doing this all day, and it had always been empty. But this time, it wasn't. Miles and miles back, so far away that they were just tiny specks, he saw 2 little white dots. and they were slowly moving along the trail, heading in his direction. It was them. The people in white were back. He was now at least 50 miles, probably more, from where he had first seen them sitting on that boulder in Lassen. This confirmed his worst fears. They hadn't just stumbled upon him twice by chance. They had been actively, relentlessly stalking him this whole time, and for some unknown, terrifying reason, they were still following him. In that moment, finishing his hike meant nothing to him. All he wanted was to get away from these people. He ripped his map out of his pack, his hands shaking. He needed to find the nearest town, the nearest road, anything. To his horror, he realized he was in one of the most remote sections of the entire trail. The nearest town, a small place called Castella, was at least 25 miles away. He didn't have a better option. He shoved the map back into his pocket, took one last look at the two white dots that were steadily getting closer, and then he turned and ran. He ran for hours, not daring to stop. He didn't even look back anymore. He just ran. When the sun started to set and the trail became harder to see, he kept running. It wasn't until it was so dark that he literally could not see his own feet that he finally, totally exhausted, stumbled to a stop. He immediately left the trail, pushing his way deep into the forest, much further than ever before, trying to get as far away from the path as he possibly could. He eventually found a small clearing hundreds of feet from the trail. He set up his tent in the middle of it, and then, with painstaking diligence, he laid out his perimeter of sticks, making it thicker and wider than ever before. He crawled into his tent, but he didn't take off his boots or his clothes. He wanted to be ready to run at a moment's notice. He lay there in his sleeping bag, his knife in his hand, terrified, with no expectation of getting any sleep. He tried to calm himself. He had run for miles. There was no way they could have kept up. There was no way they saw where he left the trail. They couldn't possibly find him here. He lay there for hours in the silent darkness. Eventually, sheer exhaustion began to take over. His eyes felt heavy. He started to drift off. And just as he was about to fall asleep, he heard it. The snap of a stick from his perimeter. Before he could even react, the whispering started again, all around him. And then, something new happened. His entire tent was suddenly illuminated with a blindingly bright light. Someone was shining a powerful flashlight or a lantern directly on his tent, lighting it up like a paper lantern. They had found him again. In the middle of the night, in a random spot hundreds of feet off the trail, they had found him. And now they were shining a light on him, letting him know they were there. Then the light clicked off, plunging him back into terrifying silence and darkness. That was the breaking point. His survival instinct took over. He wasn't going to just lie there and wait. He ripped himself out of his sleeping bag, burst out of his tent, screaming at the top of his lungs, waving his knife wildly in the air. He was screaming nonsense, just trying to make noise, trying to be big and threatening, hoping to scare them away. After a few seconds, he stopped, breathing heavily, listening. He heard a crunch of leaves right behind him. He spun around to see who was there, and as he turned, he caught a glimpse of a dark figure moving towards him fast out of the corner of his eye. He didn't think. He just ran. He sprinted away from his campsite, away from the figure, deeper into the pitch-black forest. He was running blind, crashing into trees, getting slapped in the face by low-hanging branches. He tripped and fell, scrambled back to his feet, and kept running, powered by pure adrenaline. He didn't know if he was being chased, but he wasn't going to stop to find out. After about 5 minutes of this frantic, blind sprint, his foot caught on a root and he went tumbling forward. He landed hard at the base of a large fallen tree. The tree had come to rest on a rock, creating a small, dark gap underneath the massive trunk. Without a second's hesitation, Matt wriggled himself into the gap, pulling himself under the log until he was completely hidden. He positioned himself so he could peer back in the direction he had come from. He lay there, his heart pounding, trying to control his breathing, and then he saw it. In the distance, a bobbing circle of light. It was their flashlight. They were looking for him. They were actively hunting him in the woods. He watched in absolute horror from his hiding spot as the light moved through the trees, getting closer and closer and closer. It swept back and forth across the forest floor. At one point, the beam of light passed right over his hiding spot, just inches from his face. But they didn't see him. The light kept moving, and eventually it passed by his position and continued on deeper into the forest. Matt stayed under that log for the rest of the night. He didn't move a muscle. Even when the sun came up and it was obvious that whoever was looking for him was long gone, he was still too terrified to move. He remained hidden under that log for hours, well into the early afternoon. Finally, he summoned the courage to pull himself out. He looked around. The forest was quiet. He was alone. His campsite, with all of his expensive gear, his journal, and his personal belongings, was somewhere back there in the woods. But there was no way he was going back for it. He was worried they might still be there, waiting for him. He abandoned everything. He turned and started running again, away from his campsite, back towards where he thought the trail was. When he finally found the trail, he didn't stop. He ran and walked the remaining miles all the way to the town of Castella. When he got there, a kind driver gave him a ride to the nearby town of Mount Shasta. The first thing he did was go to the police. He told them and the Forestry Service everything that had happened. They took down his report, and seeing how shaken he was, they put him up in a local motel for the night. The next day, Matt called his family. They immediately got in their car and drove down from Oregon to pick him up and take him home. His great adventure was over. Months later, Matt called the Mount Shasta police and the Forest Service to follow up. He asked if they had ever found the people in white or if anyone else had reported similar experiences. The police told him that they had received a number of reports of food and gear being stolen from campsites in both Lassen and Mount Shasta forests around that time. But Matt was the only person who had reported being actively stalked and terrorized by a mysterious couple dressed in white. To this day, Matt has no idea who those two people were or what they really wanted from him. After they stole his food, their motives seemed to change. They followed him for nearly 100 miles, somehow finding his hidden campsites in the dead of night for no other apparent reason than to torment him. How they moved so silently and how they found him time and time again in the vast wilderness remains a complete and terrifying mystery. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In April of 2020, a 17-year-old named Sam, who was a really experienced outdoorsman, decided he was going to go on a simple one-night hike. The spot he chose was the Superstition Mountains in Arizona. Now, the name of these mountains has a few different origin stories, but the one that most people agree on is pretty telling. For a long time, people have been afraid of the Superstition Mountains because of all the mysterious deaths that have happened there over the years. And because so many people would avoid the area out of a fear of some mysterious end, the place just became known as the Superstitious Mountains. But Sam, he wasn't superstitious at all. In fact, he came out here all the time to go hiking. He had a favorite trail, a particular 8-mile loop that wound its way through a deep canyon. It was beautiful, challenging, and he knew it like the back of his hand. And so, this one-night trip he had planned was going to be on that same 8-mile loop. The plan was simple. He'd hike 4 miles in, find a good spot to camp for the night, and then hike the 4 miles back out the next morning. He had planned to do it with a good friend of his, but at the very last minute, his friend had to cancel. Something came up, and he just couldn't make it. So, Sam was on the fence. He teetered on the edge of just calling the whole thing off. But in the end, he thought, you know what, I'll just do it by myself. I'm so familiar with this trail, with this area. What could possibly go wrong? On the day he was supposed to leave for the hike, his plan was to get to the trailhead early in the day. That way, he'd have the maximum amount of sunlight to get his 4 miles in and set up camp without any pressure. But life doesn't always go according to plan. Due to some unforeseen circumstances, a mix of bad traffic getting out of the city and some unexpectedly rough road conditions on the dirt roads leading to the trail, he didn't actually get to the trailhead until 5:45 inches the evening. The sun was already getting low in the sky, casting long shadows across the landscape. Sam knew deep down that it was a bad idea to start a hike this late. He was going to run out of daylight fast. He probably wasn't going to make it the full 4 miles to the specific point where he had planned on camping out. But he was young, he was fit, and he was confident. He figured with his good health and fitness, he could probably move quickly, maybe even jog part of it, and make his way to the 2 or even 3 mile mark. He knew from past hikes that there were some other suitable campsites in that area, not his preferred one, but they would do. And so he decided he would kind of risk it. He would just try to go as fast as he could and use what little daylight he had left to reach a safe place to spend the night. But the trail was tougher than he remembered, or maybe it was the fading light playing tricks on him. He wasn't able to move as fast as he thought he could. The ground was uneven, and he had to watch his footing carefully. And soon enough, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the world went from gold to purple to a deep, inky black. It was totally dark. He had his flashlight, of course, but that only cut a small, shaky circle of light into the oppressive darkness. It was only able to shine maybe 10 feet in front of him. Beyond that, the wilderness was a complete mystery. And then, at one point, as he was navigating a rocky section of the trail, he nearly fell. His foot slipped, and he tumbled sideways, catching himself just before he went over the edge of a rock. He knew if he had fallen, he would have gotten really badly hurt. And the reality of his situation crashed down on him. He was 15 miles away from the nearest help. He was in a bad cell phone service area, meaning his phone was basically useless. The roads getting out here were treacherous, especially in the dark. And nobody, not even his parents, knew exactly where he was on this trail. It dawned on him in that moment that he'd made a pretty bad choice. He realized he should stop right now, make camp wherever he was, and not try to risk it any further. And as it happened, right where he stopped, there was a forest nearby. He shined his light off the path and into the trees, and he could see a clearing about 30 feet away. He walked into that clearing, and he found it was a great spot to make camp. It was flat, sheltered by the trees, and even better, on the edge of this clearing was the remnant of an old fire pit. It was very old, just a circle of blackened rocks, but it at least showed that someone had camped out right here before. And they seemed to have made it just fine. Suddenly, he was feeling pretty smart again. He felt like he'd made a good call, and he felt pretty good about where he was staying for the night. Now, Sam had intentionally not brought a tent. He was the kind of outdoorsman who liked to sleep on a simple sleeping pad with a warm sleeping bag over that. And then he would string up a tarp over the top of him just in case it rained. Since this clearing was surrounded by a bunch of tall pine trees, he was able to easily string up his tarp between two of them. It was perfect. And pretty soon, he had a small, crackling fire going in the old fire pit. The flames pushed back the darkness and the cold, and he felt a sense of comfort. He cracked open a can of beans and began eating his dinner, watching the fire dance. But as he was eating, he started to get a sense that something was off. Something was not right. It was a subtle feeling at first, like a prickle on the back of his neck. He began scanning the tree line around his small camp as if he was going to find something out of the ordinary. But his visibility was incredibly limited. If you've ever sat right next to a campfire in a dark forest, you know that your visibility is basically a 5-foot circle around the fire. The bright light of the flames ruins your night vision, and you really can't see beyond that bubble of light. His vision was also limited by all the pine trees that encircled his clearing. So he really could only see what was immediately around him and nothing else. He started thinking, that's gotta be it. Maybe I'm just nervous because I have no visibility. I'm alone, it's late, and I can't see what's out there. It makes sense that I'd feel a little on edge. But as he was rationalizing this bad gut feeling, a rock about the size of a marble came soaring into the campsite and landed at his feet with a soft thud. He looked down at the rock. It was just a plain gray rock. But immediately, he connected that rock to the sense of dread he had been feeling. The feeling wasn't just in his head. Something had thrown that rock. He was looking around a little more aggressively now, his head on a swivel, his eyes trying to pierce the darkness beyond his fire. But again, his vision was very, very limited. He was effectively blind to whatever was out there in the woods. And so, for the next 15 minutes, Sam sat there completely still, really aggressively scanning the tree line and listening as intently as he possibly could. He didn't hear anything. He didn't see any more rocks get thrown. And so, he began to rationalize again. He started to convince himself that there was nothing wrong here. That feeling I have? Oh, don't worry about that. He started telling himself, I must have kicked a rock when I was setting up camp, and it just landed now. That's what it is. Or maybe a rock fell off a tree branch. But either way, it's something totally explainable, and you've got nothing to worry about. After a little while of repeating this to himself, he convinced himself. He got into his sleeping bag under his tarp, put his head down, and he went to sleep. A couple of hours later, Sam woke up. He didn't know why, he just snapped awake. And he had that same sense of dread, but now it was back with a vengeance. It was a heavy, suffocating feeling. He couldn't hear anything. He couldn't see anything. But he was definitely feeling like something was wrong. And at that moment, as he was lying there, listening really intently and looking really carefully into the dark, he heard the sound of rustling leaves. It sounded exactly like someone walking through dry leaves about 30 or 40 meters away from his campsite. Initially, he couldn't tell if this person, or maybe an animal, was walking towards his campsite or away from it. The sound was just there, a steady crunching in the dark. But over the next 30 seconds or so, the sounds started to fade. And he convinced himself that, okay, they've left. Whatever it was, it's gone now. And everything's fine. But just in case, he wanted to grab his flashlight and shine it in that direction, just to be sure. And so he reached next to him to the spot where he had left it when he had gone to bed a couple hours earlier. And he couldn't find his flashlight. He started patting the ground around him, feeling for it. He looked around for it, but he couldn't find it. And he's thinking, man, that's weird. I had it right here, right next to my body. And it's not here anymore. And that's when the alarm bells started going off in his head. Because the only way this flashlight moves is if he moved it. And if it's not here, how did it move? And so he jumped out of his sleeping bag. He ducked out from under the tarp, and he's looking around on the ground in the immediate vicinity of where he was sleeping, trying to find this flashlight. And as he's looking out of the corner of his eye, he saw some light. He turned his head, and in the exact same direction that he had heard those footsteps, those rustling leaves, when he was still lying down, he saw his flashlight. It was laying on the ground about 10 meters away from him, and it was on. The beam was pointing away from him into the trees, which means someone or something had been less than a foot away from him to get this flashlight that was right next to him while he was fast asleep and totally helpless. And they had moved it all the way over there. Immediately, Sam thought to himself, that's a trap. They are trying to lure me away from my campsite. They want me to leave the safety of my fire and walk into the darkness to get my flashlight. Suddenly, he felt so scared he wanted to vomit. But he knew in order to survive this situation, he needed to keep his wits about him. So he put his boots on, and he grabbed his knife. And he knew he was not leaving this campsite. In fact, he was going to build the biggest fire he could. He was going to stoke that fire as big as he could get it, and he was not going to go anywhere near that flashlight. For the next several hours, Sam just stood in the middle of his campsite, holding his knife, preparing to confront whatever the heck was out in the woods. And over those several hours, he would hear footsteps. They would approach his campsite, circle around it, and then turn around and leave. And he noticed a pattern. Every time the fire got lower, the footsteps would come closer and closer and closer. And when he would throw more wood on and stoke the fire, making it roar back to life, they wouldn't come as close. But at about 3 a.m, he ran out of firewood. So unless he went into the woods to get more, he'd be out. And he was certainly not going into the woods. That was the whole point, to avoid the woods where this thing was. And so, as the fire slowly died down, turning from flames to glowing embers, Sam prepared himself mentally for whatever happened next. Because he knew that with that fire gone, this thing was comfortable coming all the way in. It had already come all the way up right next to him to get the flashlight. And so finally, he heard the footsteps approaching. And before this, the closest they had come was maybe about 15 meters away. They were far enough away that it didn't feel intimate. It was terrifying, but he had some distance. This time, they walked right up to about 3 meters away. But they intentionally came up behind the thickest group of trees so he couldn't see them. And it was still dark outside, and he was in that small bubble of light near the dying fire, so he was blind to whatever was on the other side of those trees. But he knew they were there, and they had stopped. And for 2 hours, this poor kid stood in the middle of this campsite, facing in the direction of whatever was behind the trees. His imagination was probably going crazy at this point with what could be behind those trees. He was just waiting for whatever happened next. But ultimately, the only thing that would happen is the sun would eventually come up, and right before it actually popped over the horizon, this thing on the other side finally moved. It turned around and ran away, crashing through the underbrush. And it did not come back. And so, when the sun finally did come up, Sam didn't just charge out of there. He was still thinking there could be a trap. He waited until it was totally full sunlight. And then he packed up everything he had, and he practically sprinted back to the parking lot. He got back into his car, locked the doors, and he drove nonstop for 20 miles until he got to a gas station where he could park and collect himself. And when he got there, he got out of his car, and he went inside, and he got a drink. And when he came out, he noticed someone had written something on the dust on the back window of his car. He walked over to see what it was. And in the dust, someone had simply written, "Sleep well?" Sam is confident that whoever was stalking him at his campsite is the same person or group of people that wrote this message on his car. And now Sam just wonders what would have happened if he had tried to retrieve that flashlight. In 1982, a very outdoorsy teenage girl and boy who had recently started dating decided to go camping in Maine. Around 1 a.m. on the first night they were there, the girl woke up because she had to go to the bathroom. She was about to unzip her tent when she stopped, because she heard some strange noises coming from outside their tent. It wasn't that loud, but it sounded distinctly like something was digging in the ground. But she really had to go, and she figured, you know what, it's probably just some small animal or something, a raccoon maybe. And so she began to unzip the tent. There was a little bit of moonlight that night, and there was a clearing outside of their tent, so the moonlight was pouring through. She had plenty of illumination, and so she looked through this tiny hole, and she couldn't believe what she saw. It was a grown woman squatting down about 2 or 3 feet away from their tent. Her back was to them, so she couldn't see that the girl was looking through the tent. And she was feverishly digging into the ground in front of her with her bare hands. The girl literally fell backwards into her tent. She was so startled by what she saw. And she landed on her boyfriend, who immediately got up and was like, "What's going on?" And she just went, "Shh." And she pointed at the little hole where she had unzipped the tent. And she just whispered, "Look." The boy was confused, but he could tell his girlfriend was very serious. So he sat up quietly and he looked through the little opening in the door. And he saw the digging woman. The boy recoiled and looked at his girlfriend and he's like, "What is going on out there?" He took a flashlight and his girlfriend was telling him, "Don't do it." But he opened up the tent a little bit more and he aimed his flashlight directly on this woman. And this got her attention. She stopped digging and she stood up slowly. And she turned around and faced them. And she had no expression. She wasn't giving them any indication why she was there. She wasn't acting aggressive. She wasn't acting scared. She was just completely neutral. And she stood there staring at them for quite a while before turning around and just walking away from their campsite into the darkness. And after a little while, when they were pretty certain she was gone, they opened their tent all the way. They went outside, they kind of scanned around with their flashlights, and she was nowhere to be found. And they went to where she was digging, and it was just this weird 4-inch deep hole in the ground. There was no rhyme or reason to why she was doing that. And so after sitting there wondering what they should do, they settled on, well, tomorrow we'll tell the park rangers that she was here, and maybe they'll do something about it. And so, feeling pretty confident that this woman was not going to come back, they both went back into the tent. They zipped it shut, they got in their sleeping bags, and they were about to go to sleep when they heard someone running towards their campsite. And they knew it was this woman. They immediately unzipped the tent and they looked out. And now the woman wasn't digging anymore. She was rummaging through some of their stuff that was outside of their tent. And the way she was doing it, they described as monkey-like. She'd pick something up, look at it, and then just throw it over her head. She'd pick the next thing up, throw it over her head, back and forth, just throwing things behind her. And so the boy got out, and he shined a light on her, and he said, "You need to leave." And she didn't react. She just kept flipping through all their stuff until he got pretty forceful and said, "You need to leave right now." And at that point, she kind of stopped and looked at him like, "Huh? What are you doing here?" And then she got up, turned around, and walked away. Now, the couple really didn't know what to do because she was clearly willing to come back after being confronted. But they stayed outside their tent for about 15 more minutes, shining their light and making lots of noise and treating her like she was an animal. They were just trying to scare her away from the campsite. And after a little bit of time, they thought, okay, there's no way she comes back now because, we were pretty aggressive with her this time, and she seemed to really get it. They both did go back in the tent, and as soon as they zipped it shut, they heard her come running straight back to the site. It was like she was literally waiting in the wings for when they went back in the tent. And this time, she ran back to the hole in the ground, and she was just feverishly digging into the ground as fast as she could. And this time, they came out of their tent, and they were mad. And they were screaming at this woman to get the F out of here. What are you doing? And this seemed to kind of frighten the woman, who got up and she looked at them like, "Why are you yelling at me?" And she ran away. And it looked almost animalistic, the way she was running away, like she was feral. The boy and the girl were totally shaken up at this point. It was about 1:30 in the morning, and this woman just kept coming back to their site, and they didn't know what to do about it. So they turned on some lanterns, and they turned on their flashlights, and they decided, we're just going to stay outside until the morning. That way, we know she doesn't come back and doesn't steal anything from us. But by about 3:30 in the morning, they'd been outside for 2 hours. They were getting cold, they were super tired, and the woman was nowhere to be found. And so they finally said, "You want to go back in and get some sleep? I think this time she's really gone." They got back in their sleeping bags and they went to sleep. They didn't hear her again. The next morning, when they got up and they unzipped their tent, they looked outside and all of their stuff had been thrown all over the campsite. And the hole in the ground that the woman had dug, that was previously about 4 or 6 inches deep, was now well over a foot deep. And they realized this woman must have been lurking in the shadows in the woods, watching them from 1:30 to 3:30 in the morning. That whole time they were out there kind of warding her off. She was just waiting, just watching them the whole time in the shadows. And as soon as they went into their tent, she must have given it a little bit of time, but then she ran right back over and she ransacked their site. But the strangest thing was, after they looked through all of the stuff she had chucked around, nothing was missing. And there was some pretty expensive stuff that was laying out that she could have taken, but she didn't. After they picked up their site, they went to the park ranger and they told them about what had happened. But the ranger had no idea what to make of it. He'd never heard of such a thing. And so the couple just left that day because they were not about to spend another night here. And to this day, they have no idea why this woman was running onto their site and digging into the ground and rummaging through their stuff. It was like she was just a wild animal. In the early 2000s, a teenager named Eban and his father would regularly go hunting in the Georgia backcountry. When Eban turned 14, his father befriended a very wealthy landowner in Georgia who offered them access to one of his best private hunting areas. And just a couple of days later, on October 5th, Eben and his father would take him up on the offer. They woke up super early and they drove out to the edge of this property that was actually fenced in. They went to a main gate where they had the combo that this guy had given them. They punched in the combo, opened up the gate, drove in, shut the gate, locked it, and then continued down the access road. They followed this road for about 2 miles where it came to a stop right outside of this huge forest. They parked their truck, they got out, they put on their gear, and in the pre-morning darkness began hiking into the woods. Even though they were there primarily to hunt, Eban and his father secretly enjoyed just hiking around the woods and camping out. And any chance they got to extend their hunting trips, they would, even if the hunting wasn't good. And so since they spent a ton of time in the woods together, they noticed almost immediately when they walked into this particular forest that something was off. There were no birds. There were no animals. It was just totally silent. The only sounds they heard that were not them was a single plane that passed overhead. Although they found this very odd, they figured, you know what? This is private property. Not a lot of people are out here. I'm sure as soon as we showed up, the animals were aware of us and they've scattered. They finally made it out to the hunting stand that the owner had told them about. They got all settled in, they were getting ready to see some animals, and all day long, they didn't see a single animal. They didn't hear a single animal. In fact, again, it was just completely silent. Frustrated, they began packing up their stuff, making their way down off the stand. And they started looking for a place to make camp for the night. And Eben's father suggested, well, hey, there's obviously nothing over here. It's been quiet all day. Why don't we walk deeper into the woods a little ways, set up camp there, so tomorrow we have a better chance of seeing some animals. So they hiked for about an hour, farther away from where they parked their truck, and they reached this clearing, which was perfect for setting up their camp. And so they set up their tent, and Eban's father said, hey, we still got some daylight. Do you want to go try our luck and see if we can see some animals out here now? And Eban was like, yeah, why not? So they hiked a little ways away from their campsite, and they set up their blind. And once again, they didn't see any animals. It was totally quiet. And so they turned around, and they started heading back. As soon as they could see their campsite, which really was just their tent, they noticed that their tent was now collapsed. And Eban's father turned to him and said, oh, it must have been the wind. And Eben said, no, it couldn't have been the wind. Because all day today, we have been commenting on how quiet it is and how the fact that there's no weather, no wind, no anything is heightening the fact that it's completely silent. So it could not have been wind. So Eban's father is like, well, when you set the tent up, did you not put the posts into the eyelets? Did you not build it correctly? And Eban was like, no, I've made that tent like 1,000 times. I know it was set up correctly. They walked into their campsite and they looked down at their tent and they were really confused at what they saw. The 2 rods that go in an X over the top of the tent that thread through nylon loops and then anchor at 4 different points on the base of the tent, well, they had been removed from the 4 corners. And if you know how a tent works, it works on tension. And once you have a rod anchored in 2 points, it doesn't just pop out. It's anchored at 2 sides. It's actually difficult to remove each anchor. Once one is out, the other comes out easily. But basically, the rod would need to break in order for it to come out of those anchor points. Or someone would have to come over and remove it. And they didn't remove them, and none of the rods were broken. Which leaves them with either they failed to set up their tent, even though they had distinct and clear memories of setting it up and double checking it was set up because they put gear inside of it, or someone came over to their campsite while they were gone and undid the 4 corners. They decided, you know what? It can't be some stranger coming over here because we're the only ones with the gate combo. This is private property and no one could have been here. And why would they do that? If they came to our campsite, why would they randomly collapse our tent and then vanish? So it had to be us. We must have not made the tent right. And while they didn't really believe that they had not made their tent right, they convinced themselves that that's what happened because the alternative was just too bizarre and frankly terrifying to consider. So they built their tent again and they made a little fire. And they stayed up for a little while chatting before being tired and saying, okay, let's just go to bed. They extinguished the fire, they got in the tent, and they both fell asleep. A couple hours later, Eban woke up suddenly. And he wasn't sure if he was dreaming or not, but he thought he heard someone laughing a couple 100 meters behind their tent off in the woods. Eban instinctively turned to make sure his dad was still in the tent with him, and he was. And then Eban started listening really intently to what was happening outside. And all he could hear was silence, like it had been since they got in the woods. He didn't hear any more laughter. And so he said, okay, I must have just been dreaming, and there wasn't any laughter out there. And eventually, Eban went back to sleep. A little while later, Evan woke up suddenly again. Except this time, his dad was already awake and looking around anxiously. And Eben sat up and goes, what's going on? And his dad goes, shh. And he goes, can you hear that? And Eban listened. And to his horror, he heard laughing. He wasn't dreaming before. Eben also realized the laughter was not coming from the same area he had heard it. It was now coming from the opposite direction, and it was a lot closer to them. Eban very quietly and carefully explained to his dad that he had actually heard this laughter a couple hours earlier, and Eban's father turned to Eban and said, before we came out here, I asked the owner, should we expect any other hunters or campers or anybody nearby? And the owner said, this is private property and it's fenced in. There is no one there but you guys. After this revelation, they both turned their attention back to just listening because they were hoping this was just going to stop and whatever this was just going to leave. But it didn't leave. They heard footsteps running towards them from way off in the forest. And it was so quiet, it was really easy to hear these footsteps. And whatever this was charging towards them. And then it came to a complete stop, right at the edge of their clearing. At this point, Eben was now grabbing on to his father. Eban's father was holding on to his rifle, and he was getting ready to open the tent to confront whatever was out there. And right before he grabbed the zipper, this person, whatever it was, started laughing again. And it was practically right on top of them. It was so loud, they could hear it clear as day, right there, right outside their tent. And Eban's father took a deep breath. He grabbed the zipper, and as soon as he began moving it, the sound the zipper made caused the laughter to stop. They didn't hear footsteps, so they knew probably something was still out there, but the laughter stopped. Like it recognized that they were making noise. They were right there. They were in the tent. Eban's father froze with his hand on this zipper, and he was debating whether he should go outside or not. And before he could even make that decision, whatever this thing was turned around and ran back into the woods. And it was just gone. And for several minutes, they just sat like that, in total silence, praying that whatever this was gone for good. And after several minutes, when they didn't hear anything, there was no more laughing, there was no more running, Ebon's father re-zipped up the tent, put his hand back down, and they were both left just sitting there thinking, what the heck just happened? Ebon and his father would stay up all night and they would barely speak because whatever this thing was had heard them when they moved the zipper. And so they were really afraid of making any sound, even little sounds, because it was so quiet, sound traveled really far. And they didn't know who or what was out there. And so in silence, holding their guns, they were just waiting for the sun to come up. And as soon as it did, they were up and out of there. Literally running out of the forest, checking over their shoulder the whole time, all the way back to their truck. And so to this day, they have no idea who or what the heck was running around out there. And they told the owner of the property about it, and the owner just said, it's not possible. We have a totally gated and private piece of property, and there are cameras watching the only entrance. And you are the only ones that went in or out over that time period. And prior to that, we monitor this property. Nobody else was in there. In 2016, a 25-year-old Wall Street banker named Matt was camping near Mount Rainier in Washington state. His job was so hectic that in the rare times he got a chance to, he would disappear into the wilderness for a few days to clear his head. Despite living in one of the biggest cities in the world, Matt was actually a very competent outdoorsman. And so for this trip, he decided he would stay way off any trail, deep in the backcountry in random locations. On the first night, he found a nice clearing in the trees, and so he set up his campsite there. He ate some food over his fire, he pitched his tent, climbed inside, and within a few minutes, he was fast asleep. Several hours later, Matt woke up to some strange sounds coming from outside of his tent. It sounded like a couple of animals, or maybe one animal, moving around right outside. And so after a while of just hearing this constant sound, he rolled over and he barely unzipped his tent flap just to look out and see if he could see whatever animal it was. And what he saw shocked him. There was a man sitting in front of his fire pit. There was no fire in his fire pit. And the guy was just sitting there with his hands on his knees, looking straight down. And periodically, he would just kick his feet in the ashes of the fire pit. And Matt didn't even know what to do. So he was just looking at him through this little tiny gap in his tent. And this man all of a sudden looked up directly at Matt and made eye contact with him. And the guy's eyes went wide, and he stood up, turned around, and ran away from Matt's campsite. Matt had no idea how to react to this. And so he just quickly unzipped his tent, jumped outside, and shined his light into the forest looking for this guy. He was thinking to himself, who is this guy? I am in the middle of nowhere in the backcountry of Washington state. How long was he sitting outside there for? What does he want? And so as Matt was trying to make sense of this totally weird thing, he was thinking, okay, I'm going to look out and I'm going to see his flashlight somewhere, or I'm going to see his campsite. Maybe he's set up nearby. And he was looking around into the total darkness. He was looking through all the trees. Any light source anywhere out there, he would see. And there was not one. There was no fire, there was no flashlight, there was nothing. And so eventually, Matt went back inside of his tent. He zipped it up, and he was just left kind of dumbfounded. He couldn't understand how some person was just sitting outside of his tent for no apparent reason, and then vanished into the forest without even turning on a flashlight. And so after a very restless night, finally, the sun came up again, and Matt was very relieved. He stepped outside, and after a little bit of time now from this strange incident, Matt started to tell himself that all that was is some guy happened to set up his campsite nearby. It is possible, albeit rare because we're in the backcountry, and maybe he was just intoxicated and he wandered over here, and, stranger things have happened. So that's probably all it was. And so Matt felt like there was nothing to worry about. He packed up his campsite and he began hiking into the forest. Matt didn't have a planned route. Instead, he had a map and a compass, and he began just kind of wandering in the forest, kind of exploring wherever he wanted to go. And over the next 2 days, he covered at least 10, maybe 15 miles in kind of random zigzag directions. He found a nice clearing, and he set up another campsite. That night, he set up a fire, and he was eating some food near his fire. And then, as he was sitting there, he heard rustling coming from behind him. And he was pretty sure it was an animal, so he turned around and he didn't see anything, and he went back to eating his food. And then, a little while later, he heard some more rustling behind him. And this time, he couldn't really just write it off. Clearly, there was something behind him that was moving around. And so he stood up, turned around, and remained motionless, and just listened, expecting to see maybe a deer come out of the woods. But instead, he heard a man's voice come out of the darkness that said, "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" And Matt's heart started racing. He knew that even though he couldn't see him, it had to be the same guy he saw 2 days ago, because they were in the middle of nowhere. He hadn't seen any other hikers or campers or anyone. And clearly, this guy had the ability to sneak up on him. And so he was thinking, what does this guy want? I just spent the past 2 days hiking in random directions for 15 miles, and he must have followed me. And so Matt, not knowing what else to do, just said, "I don't know where Bell's Canyon is." And then there was silence. And Matt, one part of him was thinking, I hope this guy does not come into the light. I hope he just goes away. The other part of him was thinking, well, maybe this is a different person that is lost, and they're looking for this place called Bell's Canyon. And they'll come into the light, it'll be a big relief, I'll send them on their merry way, and everything will be fine. But as Matt was having this wishful thinking, the voice from the shadows did not come any closer, but instead asked the same question, a bit more forcefully this time. "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" This time, Matt did not respond. Now he was scared. This was not some friendly hiker looking for directions. There was something wrong. And so Matt, knowing he was all alone out here, he knew he had to do something to try to take control of this situation. And so he took a deep breath, he reached down and grabbed his flashlight, and in one swift motion, he lifted his light up and shined it in the direction of this guy's voice. And what he saw was this guy from 2 days ago looking out from behind a tree right in Matt's direction. He was hiding from him. And when the light hit him, the man barked at Matt to aim it away. And Matt kind of instinctively lowered his light, but now he was too scared to raise it again. And now he knew it was the same guy. This guy had been following him for 2 days. And so for several minutes, Matt just stood there absolutely terrified. And this guy, he just stayed out there. Matt didn't hear him move. It was just a complete standstill. And then the silence was broken yet again by this voice. Except somehow he had moved even closer to Matt. And when he came through asking the same question, "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" his voice was so close to Matt that Matt got scared and raised his light up. And the man was standing just a few feet away from him, and this time the man's eyes got wide like they did the first time they saw Matt. And he turned around and he ran into the forest again. Matt, not knowing any better, just began running after him. But he only ran for about 30 seconds before he realized the terrain out here was so rough, he was going to fall, get hurt, he was going to get lost. And this guy was already long gone. He had somehow managed to run immediately so far away, and so Matt just went back to his campsite, and he was thinking to himself, what do I do? I have no cell phone service. I'm at least 3 days away from my car, and I'm in the middle of nowhere. No one even knows where I am because I didn't chart a course, I didn't tell anyone where I was going to be. And so Matt just grabbed his knife and stood in the middle of the campsite, and for hours and hours, he just kept looking around, expecting this guy to just show up again or start speaking to him from somewhere out in the darkness. It was absolutely horrifying. Finally, by about 3 a.m, Matt was so tired that he had to go to sleep. He hadn't heard this guy again. He didn't see him again. And he figured, I need a little bit of sleep because tomorrow he was going to pack up his campsite and begin this epic journey back to his car. And so he climbed in his tent and he had a very restless next couple of hours. Then the sun came up. Matt jumped out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and began practically running in the direction of his car. All day as he was hiking, Matt kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see this guy, because clearly he had followed him for multiple days over 15 miles. And so the likelihood that he was still following him was really high. And so all day, Matt just felt like he was being watched. He was totally terrified. And then the sun started to go down, and Matt knew he would have to camp out again. And so he found a clearing in the trees, he set up his campsite, and he was so tired from running basically all day and being so mentally exhausted from this experience that he just got in his tent and fell asleep very quickly. But several hours later, he woke up to the sound of somebody walking around his tent. And he knew it had to be this guy. He was still in the middle of nowhere. He wasn't even close to the parking lot yet. And so this guy was still following him. And so Matt sat up in his tent, he clutched his knife, and for hours and hours and hours, all night, this guy just walked around his campsite, and then around 4 or 5 in the morning, he scampered off. When the sun finally came up, Matt leapt out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and literally just began running in the direction of his car, hoping that maybe he could get there before needing to camp out one more night. And so all day as he moved, he was looking over his shoulder, knowing this guy was following him. At this point, it wasn't even a question. He was somewhere in the forest, but he could never see him. And unfortunately, as the sun was setting, he knew he was not going to be able to make it to his car. He was just too far away. And so at some point, when it got too dark to keep moving, he had to find a clearing and set up his tent again. And so Matt climbed inside of his tent, he zipped it up behind him, he grabbed his knife, and he sat there expecting to hear this guy come walking around. But after several hours, he didn't hear him. And Matt started to wonder, maybe this guy had left me alone finally. Maybe he's not following me anymore. And so Matt, who was totally exhausted, laid down to go to sleep. And then as he was laying there from somewhere out in the woods, do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon? Matt immediately sat up. His heart began racing so fast that he actually was concerned he might have a heart attack. And he didn't know what to do. He didn't know what to say. So he just sat there holding his knife. And then this guy began running past his campsite, making animal sounds. And he would stop periodically and moan and grunt, and he'd kick up leaves. And then he'd run past his campsite again, over and over and over again, until the sun finally came up, and this guy scampered off back into the woods. Matt didn't waste any time. He leapt out of his tent, packed his stuff up, and ran all the way back to his car. When he finally got inside of his car, shut the door, and locked it, he cried tears of joy. He was so unbelievably relieved, and he peeled out of the parking lot. He got to a nearby hotel, he finally got cell phone reception, and he considered calling the police about this guy. But he thought, what am I going to tell them? He didn't commit a crime, he was just terrifying. And so he decided not to call the police. He finally flew back to New York, and he just had to accept that there was some strange guy out in the wilderness of Washington state who was able to hunt him over 3 days and 30 miles in rugged terrain without the use of a flashlight, without any gear. And all he ever said to Matt was, "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" In the summer of 1906, there was this couple, Dr. William Clark and his wife, Harriet. They were up in northwestern Connecticut, and they were driving along this winding country road in a place called Litchfield County. As they were driving along, it was so scenic and beautiful, with rolling hills and green everywhere. What they were doing was looking for a location in this area that could serve as a location for their second home. Dr. Clark was an oncologist, and they lived back in New York City, where he and his wife lived kind of a fabulous life. He was super successful. He was not only an oncologist, he was a big-time professor as well. And so they lived this amazing life in New York. But their lives were really hectic. New York City is a hectic place. Add in the fact that they were very social people, always going out and going to functions and this and that. And so they had some extra money and they wanted to buy or build a second home that would kind of serve as their retreat away from the city. After looking all around the country, they found Litchfield County was kind of like the opposite of New York City. Very few people were living there at the time, and again, it was this beautiful scenic place. And so it just seemed kind of like the perfect spot. So again, Dr. Clark and Harriet, they're just driving along on a beautiful day. And they eventually, in Litchfield County, they reach this beautiful red wood-covered bridge, and they go over it. And when they got to the other side, their field of view opened up because there weren't as many trees right on the other side of this bridge. And they suddenly had this view up and to the right, maybe half a mile away or something, of this weirdly shaded forest. Now you have to remember that basically everywhere they were looking, there were trees everywhere. It was very densely forested. But there was just this one kind of rise, like a pretty big prominent hill that was really dark, like totally shaded. And it was because there were two mountains or two hills on either side of it, almost creating like a valley. And so it just looked like, wow, that's a very shaded forest. And as you'll see, it's actually called the Dark Entry Forest, in part because of how shaded it is. And so they had just come out of this bridge, and they were seeing this area up on this hill. There were no buildings, nothing. It was just trees. And there was just something immediately about it that really stood out to Dr. Clark and his wife. And they noticed that the road they were on, there appeared to be like an access road that kind of splintered off the road they were on that appeared to go up into that forest, the Dark Entry Forest. And so they looked at each other and they were like, hey, let's go up there. Maybe that's the place where we can find our spot for our second home. And so Dr. Clark pulled off the main road, went on the access road, and he began making his way up towards this kind of darkened forest area. And really quickly, the road itself was very overgrown. At first, it seemed like it was relatively well maintained, but the farther up they went towards this dark forest, the rougher it got. To the point where Dr. Clark couldn't even drive on it. There were too many potholes and everything. So they ended up pulling the car over and parking. And at this point, they were actually in a bit of a clearing, and they could actually see up ahead of them where they parked. It looked almost like an entry point to the forest. The tree line was right in front of them, and there was kind of like a gap in the trees where this rugged road kind of continued into the forest, and they continued walking on foot towards the entry of this forest. Again, it was a beautiful, scenic, very sunny, beautiful day. They were super excited, and they walked into the shade of the forest, and right away, it was like all the sunlight basically vanished. But not in a spooky way, kind of like they lowered the brightness slightly. And it was very quiet. The canopy in Dark Entry Forest is known for being really, really thick, and so not much light was pushing through. But it created almost like they were walking into a bubble. It was just pure, unadulterated silence and peace. And as they were walking on this road, which quickly became mostly like a little path, it didn't even look like a road at some point. It was just kind of like grass that had been pushed down. Clearly, not many people or anything were coming into this forest, at least not from this direction. And as they were walking along, they were looking around, and they were like, this place is so beautiful. I mean, it was already beautiful, but this was especially beautiful. Like they walked maybe a couple hundred feet into the forest, and off to their right was this apple orchard. Untouched, no one was taking these apples. It was just like a wild apple orchard. And there were deer that were just eating the apples off the tree. And they were looking over at Dr. Clark and his wife, and they were completely unafraid. They didn't see people, so this was not terrifying for them. Deer just eating their apples. And then on the other side of the road, there were these huge fields full of flowers that, again, trees were everywhere, but there were all these flowers at the bases of the trees. Lilies and roses and yellow bitter tansies, or things, that's what they're called. So all of these beautiful flowers, And then at some point, as they walked a little bit farther into this dark entry forest, the sunlight that was poking through, it was hitting the ground in such a way that it was actually sparkling. Because this forest was actually on a hillside, and there was this mineral called mica. If you're familiar, it's like this little translucent, it almost looks like kind of clouded glass that's actually a mineral that comes from the ground. And when the sunlight hits it, it kind of looks like it sparkles. And so they were looking around at these wild animals that were unafraid of them, and flowers, and there were babbling brooks and streams. I mean, it was like out of a Disney movie. This was like a perfect place. And so by the time the couple came out of Dark Entry Forest, and this was only, they walked around for maybe an hour or so, by the time they were coming out, they were completely sold that that was going to be where they went ahead and bought their land to build a second home. And so they went back to New York City and they put in the paperwork to buy the land. And they bought 1,000 acres in this forest, which is ridiculous to imagine, just casually buying 1,000 acres anywhere. But they did. They bought their 1,000 acres. And as soon as they had it, as soon as it was finalized, Dr. Clark began calling around to all these builders, local builders in Connecticut, that could help him build his home. And he had no intention of building some humongous home. They bought a huge amount of land, but they only wanted to build a small cabin. But despite the job being relatively simple, and despite Dr. Clark offering quite a bit of money to anybody who was willing to go out there and build this for him, none of the builders would do it. They never really gave a straight answer to Dr. Clark about why they would not go into Dark Entry Forest. But universally, no one would do it. And so Dr. Clark, he definitely was discouraged by that, but he just kind of chalked it up to, okay, so obviously it's kind of an isolated place. It's relatively hard to get into Dark Entry Forest. And where they had bought this land, it was pretty far into the forest. And so he just decided, okay, it just might not be worth it for them. It's logistically kind of a nightmare. They don't want to do it. And so Dr. Clark was undeterred, and he decided he would just build the house himself. Dr. Clark, he grew up on a farm in New Jersey. He was a very handy guy. He had built buildings before, so this was something he could do. And so over the next several months, every weekend, Dr. Clark would make his way on his own to Dark Entry Forest. And it also was full of owls that were hooting all the time. So there was like this audio of being in this forest, which was really intense. Like there were owls hooting constantly. And actually, Dr. Clark and Harriet thought it was really cute that these owls, it seemed like they were almost personally greeting them as they came into the forest. And so Dr. Clark, every weekend for several months, he would go into Dark Entry Forest and be greeted by the owls. And he would go to the land where the 1,000-acre land was, and actually he had identified this one kind of flat spot in the 1,000 acres that was good for building a home. And so the first thing he did over these several weekends he was out there is he just cut down this massive swath of hemlock trees, just kind of clearing out that flat area. And then he chopped up the trees, he cut down into lumber, and he used that to build a rustic, simple 2-story cabin. And then after this cabin was built, kind of up on this hill, there happened to be another hill not too far away from the cabin where there was a freshwater spring right at the top. And so Dr. Clark, he went up and laid piping from the freshwater spring down to his cabin, so they had fresh water in the cabin. And then down the hill from where the cabin was constructed was a small brook, and Dr. Clark, he found himself always going down and just staring into this beautiful brook because there were all these trout, because nobody fished out here. This was like an abandoned place, basically. There were all these trout just swimming around, unencumbered, just leaping out of the water. And so he ended up actually building a swimming pool right next to the brook, specifically so he could sit in the swimming pool and watch the trout. And so by Thanksgiving of that year, so 1906, by Thanksgiving, the property was done. The cabin had been built, everything was done. And so that holiday season, Dr. Clark and Harriet and their whole family would come out and they would spend the holidays, sitting in their pool, watching the trout and just having a wonderful time. And really, for many years, every summer and every major holiday, the Clark family would come out to their beautiful dark entry cabin and they would stay there. And it was really perfect. That is until 1918. In 1918, in the summer, Dr. Clark and Harriet were at their cabin and they were having a nice time when Dr. Clark got word that he was actually being called back to New York City for an emergency. Remember, he's an oncologist, so these things happen. And he was called back. And for whatever reason, Harriet, who normally likely would have joined him and just gone back to New York with him, she decided to stay. I mean, they had been coming here for years by this point, so she probably felt somewhat comfortable. Although admittedly, she was very unhappy about this. She didn't want to be there alone. But again, she decided to stay. But she told Dr. Clark, because she didn't know how long he would actually be in New York, and he didn't really know either, but she said, "You have to promise me you'll be back here as soon as you possibly can." And Dr. Clark would tell her that, I'll do my best, should be back here in maybe, a couple of days from now. And I promise you, I will come home as soon as I possibly can. And so Dr. Clark packed up his things and he and his wife, they left their cabin. They walked their way down the trail, listening to the owls and looking at the mica sparkling on the ground. And they left the forest and they made their way to a nearby train station, which actually was not that far away from the entry to the forest. And Harriet dropped off her husband and she watched as he boarded and it began taking off and he disappeared to go to New York. And Dr. Clark, as he's vanishing, traveling on this train, he's thinking to himself that, okay, I'll be in New York just for a couple of days. I'll be home. I'll be back in no time. Little did he know, over the course of time he was going to be in New York, his wife would endure something that is just truly horrifying. So before I explain to you what happened after Dr. Clark left, you need to understand some history about this forest. History that Dr. Clark and Harriet did not look into before deciding to purchase these 1,000 acres. Because had they done the research into this area, they likely would not have bought the land. So there actually used to be a town that was settled in the Dark Entry Forest. It was called Dudleytown, and it was settled in the 1740s. And at first, it was just a couple of families just getting by. But pretty quickly, it grew to about 30 families and several structures and houses and the whole 9 yards. It was a small community inside of this beautiful forest, and things were great. For a small town in the 1700s, things were stable. But starting in the end of the 1700s, like in the 1790s, up till about the 1800s, things started to go really, really badly in Dudleytown. And in fact, because of how badly it went, it earned this conclusion that Dudleytown had to be cursed. And that lore had spread around, which is actually why those builders refused to do the work for Dr. Clark, because they believed it was a cursed place. So this is what led to it being believed to be cursed. And I'll tell you, it's pretty creepy. So it started with the Carter family. The Carter family was a big family inside of Dudleytown. And it was in 1792, there was this cholera epidemic that broke out in this small town. And 6 members of the Carter family died really suddenly from cholera. And the remaining members of the Carter family, which was significant, I think there were a dozen people still left, might have been a few less than that, but a pretty good chunk of people, they were so grief-stricken from the loss that they decided to just literally abandon their houses in Dudleytown and go back to New York City, where they happened to be from as well, same as Dr. Clark. But as soon as they got to New York, they were massacred by natives that lived in the area. And the only people that survived this massacre were 3 children. And the 3 children were kidnapped and never seen again. And so that was the start of bad things happening to people in Dudleytown. The next thing that happened is there was a guy named Hollister. We don't know his last name, but he either fell off a roof or he was pushed. We don't really know, but either way, he died. But he died on or near another person's home, whose name was Tanner. So Hollister died and died on or near Tanner's home. And after Hollister died, which again, it was shrouded in mystery, Tanner, the owner of the home where this guy died, he began talking obsessively, and it's documented, obsessively about strange creatures lurking around the tree line inside of Dark Entry Forest, right around Dudleytown every night. That was all he saw. So a guy dies, and all of a sudden, Tanner is noticing all these strange creatures. And he's telling everybody in town that there's something going on here. Nobody believed him. And so slowly, Tanner, every night, he would see whatever he was seeing, and it drove him insane, completely insane, to the point where he couldn't even function, and his wife and his daughter had to take care of him until he passed away. And as Tanner was losing his mind, his next-door neighbor, whose name was Abel, began to talk as well about these creatures that were coming to the edge of the tree line surrounding Dudleytown most nights. And just like Tanner, Abel as well slowly lost his mind over these creatures because nobody believed him. And then all the way up until just past the 1800s, so many people just randomly died in Dudleytown. Some from disease, for sure, but others, they'd just be found dead. And then many people as well began citing these strange creatures that were lurking all around. By 1900, the only family that was still alive in Dudleytown was this family called the Brophies. And it was a fairly big family. And the mother, she suddenly died of cholera. The two sons, they were accused of theft in another town and then fled and vanished. And so literally it was down to John Brophy, the actual last person who was living in Dudleytown. And one night, he didn't know why, apparently, but his cabin burned to the ground. And after his cabin, or while his cabin was burning, people were called out, they saw the smoke, they came out to put out this fire. And the last anyone saw of John, who had lost his whole family, he'd lost everything, is he just turned and walked deeper and deeper into the forest and was never seen again. And no one could find him. That was it. And that was the last person who lived in Dudleytown. And that marked the moment that Dudleytown went from still being occupied to being a literal ghost town. And you can actually look up the newspaper article that documented the moment when Dudleytown became a ghost town. No one lived there. A few years later is when Dr. Clark and Harriet were taking their stroll through Litchfield County and up into Dark Entry Forest and saying, wow, this is the place for us. And they saw the ruins of Dudleytown. They walked past the crumbling foundations of these old homes, and there were all these remnants of this town that was still there. But much the way they viewed the owls as being kind of charming, they also viewed this rundown old town that was gone as kind of cute. And it made them want to stay there more. So they were aware of the town, but didn't do the research. Apparently, Dudleytown was cursed, and that is where they bought their land. So fast forward to 1918. Dr. Clark, he's left for this emergency trip to New York, and it would turn out he was only needed in New York for 36 hours. It was as short as he could have expected it to be. So, less than 2 days later, keeping his word to his wife, he was back on a train and he was heading back to that stop where Harriet had dropped him off near the Dark Entry Forest. And although this was rare, that doctor, Clark would leave his wife in the cabin. He expected her to be waiting for him at the train station. They didn't have an exact time that he was going to be there because it wasn't entirely planned, but he had said, I'll be here in like 1 or 2 days max. And so he just kind of expected his wife to check the schedule and be at the train platform. But as he's pulling into the station, he sees his wife is not there. Now, this was not some huge cause for concern, but it was enough of a red flag that as he's pulling into the station, Dr. Clark was thinking, something feels off. And so he ended up going from the train station, and he actually walked the rest of the way. He didn't take a car or anything. He walked to that access road and made his way up to the entry of Dark Entry Forest. And as soon as he walked into the forest, so it was daylight out, he stepped into the canopy and it was dark again. And remember, it used to feel so welcoming and wonderful going into that forest. It was so peaceful. But now it had a different feel. He stepped into the forest, and suddenly it felt threatening. It felt ominous. And the owls that were hooting the whole time he stepped in, it didn't feel like they were greeting him. It felt like they were telling him to leave. But he had to find his wife, and he was thinking, she's up at the cabin, that's where we need to go. And so he began kind of jogging, fast walking. He was getting a little nervous through the forest. And as he was moving through, the sounds of these owls were getting louder and louder and louder and more threatening, until finally, when he got to the clearing, when he could actually look up and see where he built his cabin up on this hill, it was like a cacophony of noise. It was just constant hooting, almost like it didn't even sound like hooting. It was just a loud sound that was constant. And so Clark was starting to panic. But he got even more panicked when he looked up at the cabin. He didn't see his wife, but he saw the front door to this cabin, was slightly ajar. And so Clark, he ran the rest of the way up the hill, owls hooting the whole time. He got to the door, and he was terrified. He knew there was something wrong here, but he got the courage, he opened up the front door, and the second he stepped into this home, which he had loved and spent years and years in with his family, he stepped in, and everything was different. Instead of it being peaceful, he now felt this almost high-pitched sound, like inside of his head for a second. And he was confused. And then he heard what sounded like maniacal laughter coming from the second floor. He didn't see anybody on the first floor. He thought it was his wife. And so he charged upstairs. He got to the landing, and he saw the door to his bedroom, where he would expect his wife to be, was slightly open. And he could hear this laughter coming from inside of this room, this maniacal, crazy, loud, high-pitched laughter. And he was totally panicked. He went to the door, and he opened it up. And there, in the back corner of the bedroom, was his wife. And she was in the fetal position. And her mouth had been opened as wide as it could go. And the laughter that he was hearing was coming out of her body, but her jaw wasn't moving. Her chest was heaving, and this maniacal laughter was just coming out of her as she stared him dead in the eyes. And so Clark, he was so terrified at what he was seeing and all the hooting and all this craziness going on that he just turned and ran away. We don't know what happened to Harriet Clark over those 36 hours that her husband was gone, but something happened to her. And when she was taken away from this cabin, the only thing she would say is, the strange creatures kept coming back. I kept seeing strange creatures, the same thing that all the people in Dudleytown had said that caused them to flee the town. And so we don't know exactly what became of Harriet. There is one account that says she was forever. She went to a mental hospital and stayed there until she passed. Another account says she went back to New York with Dr. Clark, where she took her life. But either way, the final thing was she claimed to have seen the strange creatures and lost her mind as well. Following this story, Dark Entry Forest really took on this unbelievable legend. I mean, people knew about this story. They knew about the legend of the 1700s and 1800s, but this felt recent. This was a documented case of this doctor's wife. And so it spawned a lot of people going into Dark Entry Forest to see what's out there. And lots of people who went into that forest before it became illegal reported feeling phantom hands slapping them on the back and feeling really intense pockets of cold air. And actually, the very famous paranormal couple, Ed and Lorraine Warren, in the 1970s, they went out and ran a special series about what happened in the Dark Entry Forest. And they came out and said, absolutely, that forest is demonically possessed. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya.